There we go. Hello and welcome back again to what might be our final interview for a while. This is with a very special guest, Magnus Seter. Did I pronounce that right?
Well, it's Magnus Seter, but English-speaking people can't pronounce my name, so that's okay. It's close enough.
Yeah, especially Americans, we struggle with names. So you are a game designer, game writer. You have done a lot. So for people who might not know you or want to get to know you a little bit more, can you introduce yourself and your impact on the RPG industry?
Well, the impact, I'm not sure about the impact. But, my name is Magnus Seter. I'm 51 years old and I've been working I've been freelancing as a game writer since 1989. I started writing for Cyberpunk 2020. I did some early work for Talsorian Games on the Cyberpunk 2020 game. Playtesting, and I wrote some adventures for them. And after that, I approached the Swedish publishers of a game called Mutant.
Nice.
And I asked if I repurposed some old Cyberpunk adventures that I've written for conventions here in Sweden. And I asked them if they wanted to publish them in their gaming magazine. And they said, yeah, sure, we'll do that. So it's quite an oddity in Sweden. I started writing for the American industry, and then I transferred back into the Swedish industry. But I wrote some Cyberpunk. They had a Cyberpunk game, basically, the Mutant game that is Mutant Year Zero now.
Yeah.
At that time, it was a Cyberpunk inspired Cyberpunk inspired game. So my work for the convention circuit in Sweden for Cyberpunk 2020 fit very well with that. So I did some things about some articles about that, and then one of my first articles was for this Cyberpunk game, and the Target Games who created Kult sent me 3 floppy disks, and they said, "Can you write a crossover between our Cyberpunk game and this new horror game that Gunilla and Micke have written?" And that was, of course, Kult. So I got to sit down and print it on my Matrix printer, and I read through it, and I wrote a crossover article between those 2 games. And that was my first encounter with Kult, actually. And then I did some work for Target Games. I wrote the first edition of the Mutant Chronicles game. If you're familiar with that, there's a 3rd edition now by Modifius. And after I did that, I did some work for Target Games, writing some generic fantasy gaming material. And then they approached me saying that we need to look at Kult because it's quite a heavy game. It's we're trying to market it in the States, so we're also trying to build an intellectual property around it. So we have to look at it from a different perspective, and that's where my greatest impact on the Kult history occurred. Since I then, together with some of the producers at Target Games, wrote the 2nd edition of Kult. And after that, I've been doing some stuff. Just recently, The Bitter Reach was released for the Forbidden Lands.
Yeah, I saw that. Really cool.
Yeah. It looks really nice. It was quite a job doing it. It's 2 novel-sized. It's 300 pages, and it was a lot of writing behind it, so that was cool. And also, that's probably why Petter or Marco, I think Petter was it that put you in contact with me. He asked me also a while ago if I would contribute to Kult Divinity Lost as well.
For Kult Divinity Lost, what are you bringing to the table? What is kind of the future of concerning your writing for it?
Yeah, I'm actually bringing the past. since what I'm doing is updating the introductory adventure for the second edition of Kult called His Last Hope, which was published in the Swedish rulebook and also in White Wolf magazine. A short adventure that was quite liked by the fans at the time, and there were even some unofficial sequels written for it, which was kind of cool, actually. Yeah. So I've been updating that with the help of Petter and trying to make it into more of what I wanted to do at the time, but couldn't sort of envision doing at the time. So now it's a more I'd say it's more deeper. It's more horrifying, actually, and it takes on some of the themes of His Last Hope that we couldn't dwell too much on at the time. And also what I did when Petter and Marco and Robin did the Divinity Lost game, I got to sit down with Petter and explain our thinking behind the second edition of Kult and why we did what we did at the time, which wasn't. It was quite a different take on Kult than the Divinity Lost, the original game, and Divinity Lost, of course. Yeah. But I wanted to explain why that happened and make him aware of that. As far as I was concerned, the original Kult had some flaws, some things that were challenging. That I hoped that Petter and the crew would address in Divinity Lost, of course.
Did they? Please be honest.
Well, the thing is, Kult is a difficult game. It's a challenging game, and what we wanted to do back in '94 or '95, I can't remember when I wrote the second edition, actually. But what we wanted to do was to make it more accessible, easier for the players to get into, easier for the game masters to get into. And while we did that, we lost a little bit about the deep mythological, philosophical, theological basis that is Kult, because we wanted to make it into an intellectual property that it could be monetized, basically, with the comics and movies and stuff like that. So we wanted to add a meta plot, because that was all the rage at the time. A vampire was dominant at the time. So we wanted to add a meta plot, and we wanted to add some stuff that made it easier, simpler for people to grok the campaign world, basically. And also we wanted to address the, I don't know if that was the satanic panic, but Target Games did run into some problems marketing Kult in the States at the time. So they and we wanted to sort of turn down the sex and the violence and bits like that. Basically make it into not as offensive a game as people thought the original Kult was. Mm-hmm. Now that I look back at it, I think that was an impossible task to take on, because it is Kult. It is a horror game. It's a horror game in the vein of Clive Barker and his writings and his movie makings and his vision. It's a game that is inspired heavily by that, and I don't know if you can make that into a game that the moral right, or more those who have those kind of objections to the game, that they will accept. Mm-hmm. So I think that maybe that was something that we couldn't do. We tried, but well. The thing is as well that at the moment, 94, 95 RPGs took a nice nosedive. People are still arguing about why, but that was Magic. The Gathering game came out. So Target Games, the publishers of Kult, effectively after a few years stopped making role-playing games. Anyways, so that was why Kult sort of fell by the wayside until it was picked up by Helmgast now. Of course, there has been a third edition. This is, I think you can say, Divinity Lost is the fourth or fifth edition. I don't know, but
yeah,
there was a
fourth.
Yeah, exactly. Because the third was from Citian Siècle or something, the French publisher, who took first edition and second edition and mashed them together into something. I haven't read it. I don't read French very well, but I haven't read it. But it didn't. The stars weren't right at the time.
Yeah. Well, how about this iteration? What are things you like about it? Maybe things that could be improved. What are your thoughts on it?
I think that Helmgast has embraced the mythology of Kult in a very, very good way. Because when the first edition Kult came, I remember in the Swedish box we had 3 booklets. We had one that was sort of like any modern role-playing game. No horror at all, nothing at all. And then we had 2, 3. Well, anyway, we separated the first Target game separated the world and the rules, so that you could basically sit down and say, well, this Kult game it's a modern game about stuff, and then gradually you would sort of discover the veil and what goes on behind that, which meant that it took a while, and then the players were like, wow, this is so cool. But what would you do then? Because then you had played it as a normal game, and then you introduced the veil, and what happened later. And I think that's something that Helmgast has done with the format as well, because they have shorter adventures. They have often they have pre-generated characters. His Last Hope will use 4 pre-generated characters, and that means that they have sort of compartmentalized the scenarios so that you can play it and you know that you're playing Kult, and still it's an experience that is sort of bite-sized, and then you can discard those characters and you can try something else, something different. And I think that's very good. And of course the artwork and the writing and the tone and the style. And also I think that what they did, which was very good, was to sit down with Michael and Gunilla, who wrote the game, and sat down and said, okay, so what is this all about? And then they built on that. And so I think that's basically the best thing they've done. And also they changed the rules. I think that's a good idea. To have these this powered by the apocalypse rules. I think that lends itself better to Kult as a game. In my opinion. Excellent. It looks fabulous. It looks so good. It does.
Yeah. Bastien Delharme, who does the cover art for it, is amazing, brilliant person.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What got you into kind of horror writing? Because it looks like you've done stuff with cyberpunk, and that's kind of dystopian with some kind of elements of horror, but definitely kind of a different genre for Kult.
That's actually a very good question, and no one has asked me that before. So I haven't thought much about why I'm into. I was heavily into horror. But I guess that's something that came with RPGs at the time. I started gaming in 1982 with the Swedish translation of Magic World, and we set up a gaming club in the town where I lived, and we played games, and then we went to each other's houses and watched pirated videos, basically. And that sort of used to be, it was common that was horror movies. Amityville and Evil Dead and things like that. So 85 to 95, I watched a lot of horror movies, and I don't know what really drew me to that genre. I think I enjoy strong emotions, and I also enjoy atmospheric scenes, and also I quite enjoy shock horror. Which is something that actually was one thing that we wanted to add a bit more to Kult in the second edition. That we wanted to be more shock and visceral emotions to quicker bring the horror to the players, which in turn meant that we compromised the cult, the feeling of being Kult. So it became something more like a more straight Hellraiser game. So it lost a bit of its the character of the game.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Horror is cool, and I think I liked running horror games. I played Call of Cthulhu since 1984 or 5 or something like that, and I always liked having my players sit on the couch and just put up their legs on the couch because they didn't want them dangling down beneath the couch so that someone could grab them. I loved eliciting that kind of response from the players in Call of Cthulhu or in Kult, for example.
Yeah. And you wrote for Cyberpunk 2020, and then kind of moved on to Mutant and now Forbidden Lands with the new book. What was it called again? Bitter Reach?
The Bitter Reach. Yeah.
Bitter Reach. So kind of looking back at kind of the first couple, the first decade that you were writing, and then now, how do you see you kind of changed as a writer and how you approach making these books?
I think I actually have been thinking a little bit about that since when I started writing. Let me backtrack a bit. In Sweden, we role-playing games started in 1982 to become sort of mainstream. Of course, there were people playing and writing for role-playing games before that, but in 1982 it started. And those people who were involved at the time, sort of like the first generation RPG writers. Then we have the second generation, and that's me and some other people. And at the time, all it took was to put together something that people could read and understand what you had written. The bar wasn't very high. The most important thing that you could do if you wanted, same thing with Cyberpunk, the best thing you could do was put together something that people could read and understand what you had written, and that had some sort of structure that could be easily interpreted by the game master into, okay, this is how I play this.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it was easy or simple, but it wasn't. At the time, you didn't need to be a genius. You didn't need to know a lot about game design in general to get something published, because if you had the knack for it, and you could put together something that people would be able to play, that was the most important thing. So much of my early writing wasn't very creative, but it was very well structured and put together so that the game masters could use it. It was basically railroading. Many of my most enjoyed adventures that people say that they enjoy are very simple adventures that are sort of railroady, but that delivers a lot of emotion and a lot of action and a lot of fun, basically. So that was what I did. I delivered well-structured material. Now there's so much competition. There's so many great writers. There's so many people creating good stuff that I've been sort of a little bit intimidated, because you sit there and think, oh, so what are people doing that? They're doing Kult, for example. They're doing Mörkborg. They're doing Forbidden Lands. And now we're just talking about the Swedish guys. And we're talking about Lamentations of the Flame Princess. We're talking about a lot of other stuff that's visceral and horrifying and very much more grounded in a knowledge of game design and game design writing today. So the theoretical basis for writing is much more solid now.
More stuff to pull from, especially now that there's like classes for game design and writing
exactly.
and coaching, and like there's way more material for people to kind of set out and learn from their predecessors than when you started writing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it was quite fascinating to me when the D20 license came around in 1999 or 2000. That reminded me of the early days, because I bought a lot of D20 material because I was like, this is interesting. I want to see what other people are doing, and a lot of it wasn't very good because anyone could sit down and write, and a lot of it wasn't very good. But since the market at the place rewarded just putting out stuff, anyone could put out stuff, and now the quality of everything is so much higher. Winning in any now is a much greater achievement than it was 20 years ago, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at the any nominees for this year, you're looking at some pretty amazing material. Even last year and the year before that was just the same. So as someone who's kind of moved from writing for kind of the American audience and writing for the Swedish audience, do you kind of do you write in a different way, or is it pretty much the same?
To me, it's pretty much the same. Most of my I don't know. It's most of my writing is inspired by American games, of course. I didn't start with an American game. I started with a translation of an American game, but I moved on to Dungeons & Dragons in 1984, I think, or 84. 1984, and I played a lot of basic expert companion masters, Dungeons & Dragons. So I was sort of brought up on those kinds of sensibilities. But then I was inspired by White Dwarf, the magazine from Games Workshop, and of course my favorite game, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is a horror game in a fantasy world. So it's somewhere there. I'm still thinking of why no one has asked me why I enjoy horror, because I do, and I enjoy horror in a fantasy environment as well. But I think that if, for example, we take the Bitter Reach, which is a campaign expansion for Forbidden Lands, I think the style of that is distinctly Scandinavian in so much it's not as much dungeon crawling, and it can be quite wordy, but it's also quite atmospheric and quite a lot to read, actually.
That's good. I mean, as a GM, I always kind of like something beautiful to read, but also to be able to communicate the story to the player, which I think is kind of one of the changes that has occurred in kind of the industry is when you're selling a book, you're not only thinking about kind of is this going to be fun for the players, but you're thinking, is this going to be enjoyable for the game master to read?
Yeah, exactly. That's something that Paizo have stated about their adventure paths, is that they want them to be both playable but also enjoyable to read for the game master, because quite a lot of people who subscribe to their adventure paths don't have the time to play them all, basically. There's thousands and thousands of pages. I've managed to play one of the Paizo adventure paths. I played Kingmaker, or a game mastered Kingmaker, and that took a while. And after that, I wasn't really keen on doing it again. Actually,
it's definitely a long time commitment, especially depending on how many times you can play, like per week or month.
Yeah, exactly. And when you get up to level 15, 20 for the PCs, it's quite a daunting task to manage that. But I don't know. I don't know. Has anyone else said anything about sort of like the differences between Scandinavian writing and American writing?
So far, no. And of course, like a lot of the people we've interviewed have kind of primarily written for either the American audience or really any other country audience from the kind of many people I've been able to talk to. Sometimes they're translated, but of course that's kind of out of their hands, and it's really the interpretation of the translator. But so far, even like I was talking to Amit Moshe, who Son of Oaks is a game or publisher, is based in Israel, and I was asking, is there a difference, because in terms of the West and the Middle East, there's definitely a lot of cultural differences, and so one might think that, hey, would you approach the game design in a different way? But no, it's the same from what I've heard from all these different people, which is interesting to think about. And so it's something I've always been like curious about, kind of just see the differences of people, but still the approach to storytelling in very similar ways.
I can of course only speak for myself, but the rejection letters I've received from American publishers, if I want to look at that and try to find a pattern, I think that some American games, some dominant American games, are more about location, and in Scandinavia we write more for plot. It's not, we don't write as much this is a dungeon that needs to be explored, but instead we say that this is the situation that needs to be resolved, and it's not only placed in one place. It's sort of like becomes more of a sprawling, interconnected, plot driven game.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really just have to look at kind of the marketing of D&D and like the elemental evil planes and stuff like that. Usually their APs are definitely the premier thing on the cover, and the name of it is pointing to a location or a dungeon that has to become eradicated. So it's really interesting to hear kind of the story plot focus compared to
and also it's no coincidence that my favorite, maybe you can guess my favorite Dungeons & Dragons adventure, given the plot and horror elements.
Curse of Strahd.
Yes, and of course the original Ravenloft adventure. I've played that quite a lot of times, and I love the Ravenloft campaign setting, and I love the Curse of Strahd as well, and I think that any edition that does an iteration of the Ravenloft world, I buy that game book, even if I don't have the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons books at home, but I own the Curse of Strahd book, because it's horror, it's fantasy, and it's very much plot driven.
Yeah. So I mean, you love horror, you love fantasy. Bitter Reach, how much of these two elements are in it?
Ooh. Not as much as you would think.
So what is Bitter Reach about?
Well, Bitter Reach is more about survival in the cold north, and exploring. Of course, I say, well, we have plot, not locations, and then I write a book about exploring locations. But it's more of you play in the world locked in eternal ice, and then you explore ruins of an old race that is exposed, and several power players come to that place and try to take control of the situation and take control of the emerging power that comes from the ruins. So it's more like, what would it be?
Maybe like survival horror.
Yes, it's more survival horror. Yes, exactly. And a survival horror fantasy. In a way, I did try to put in some more grim stuff, because when you're cold and you're out and you get stuck in a pass, maybe a donor pass somewhere, you tend to eat what you have at hand. So I did put in some of that, but I think that was cut out of the book, because cannibalism isn't really a nice fantasy trope.
But like every player is going to think about it sometime during the campaign.
Oh yeah, and I will write some stuff of my own and just put out some PDFs and then see what happens. But I did try to work with the undead. I have written an adventure for that, for the Bitter Reach as well, an expansion adventure that's supposed to be published whenever the corona situation is cleared up. And that's more horrific when it comes to horror, but that's more Evil Dead kind of horror, not Cult.
Evil Dead definitely has a distinction from Cult.
So why do you like Cult?
I mean, for me, Cult is kind of the premier horror game I've always wanted. And I've played Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, Vampire Requiem Masquerade. I've played a couple of other indie horror games, Dread and stuff like that. But for me, what I really like about Cult is kind of the horror from within. I'm kind of I feel like Call of Cthulhu does a great job with horror from without, and I mean, you just watch the Color of Space, the Call of Cthulhu movie, and it was awesome with Nicolas Cage going crazy.
The new one, yeah, that was strange.
But one of my favorite movies is a Korean film called I Saw the Devil, which is really just kind of about this detective's downfall when his wife is murdered and he's trying to track down the killer. And the most interesting part about that is just watching his moral degradation. And I really like that aspect of gameplay in Cult. I love watching, because I GM a lot and I play every now and then. But I love watching the players kind of struggle with what should I do and who am I becoming, and I'm off the deep end. I'm just going to start killing people, or I'm going to kill myself, or do other horrific things. And it's just kind of like just watching the horror be brought by my own players instead of me having to bring it to them is very interesting and fascinating, and something I've always enjoyed watching.
I think it's a good observation there when you said that. What was the name of the movie?
I Saw the Devil.
I Saw the Devil, because when we worked with Cult, when I worked with Cult in the 90s and looked for the second edition, I did watch the Hellraiser movies, of course, and I read the Hellraiser comics and read the Hellraiser books, and I was whoa, Hellraiser. But now I would say that if you want to sort of figure out what is it in Cult that makes Cult interesting, I would say that you should watch The Serpent and the Rainbow, Angel Heart, for example, Jacob's Ladder.
Yeah,
especially Jacob's Ladder, because Jacob's Ladder is sort of what you described, someone degenerating and unable to make sense of the world around him. And it turns out that it has an explanation at the end. And then you go, wow, that was so cool. Also, The Serpent and the Rainbow is cool, and Angel Heart. More noir films, I think, inspires me for Cult.
Yeah, I love that genre in general, and especially running it. It's something that kind of, it brings such a visceral image into your head about where you are in the setting that you're in than probably any other genre I know. It's just perfect.
And that's interesting because as a writer, people often ask me, okay, so how do you do? How do you do it? What are your ideas? How do you get your ideas? And I've talked to other writers, of course, about that, and other game masters. You don't have to be a writer to have ideas. You just have to be a game master.
Yeah.
But for me, I often start with an image in my head. That this is a cool image. How could I arrive at this image when writing something? So how would I set up something to show this to my players, and not show it as in a drawing or an illustration, but how can I show it with words? And I think that's something about, for example, His Last Hope, that would be a part of the stretch goals for the latest Kickstarter for Kult. Basically started out with thinking about, okay, so someone is sitting at home in front of a fire, and something is scratching the walls of the house, trying to get into that person, to get to him and to do something. Why would that happen, and what would happen then? And I started to sort of like peel the layers of the onion and try to figure out, okay, so why is it there? What's going on, and how can I bring the players there? The player characters, of course, not the players, but how can I bring the characters there? And what would they do then? Because that's also a thing. Is that as a game master, as a writer, I mustn't. No, I mustn't. But I shouldn't set up an image and say this is what they will see.
Yeah.
Whatever they do. No, I see this is something they will see, and then they have to be able to do something about that. So that their experience is I'm not trying to get them to see something cool, and that's the thing. I'm trying to get them to experience something cool so that they can be triggered into, okay, so now we'll do this.
Yeah.
And that's also sorry.
Oh, go ahead, please.
And that's also one thing that strikes me as something that's very important for the writing is to use the words to conjure up an image of a situation or a place or a location without making decisions for the players.
Yeah,
the players have to be able to describe a situation without saying, and then you do this and then you do this. But they have to know what's going on, but then they have to know then they have to decide what they want to do. And that's also one thing about Kult, is that since it's such a horrific game, it's perfectly in character to just sit down and do nothing.
Yeah.
Or run away, or just try to kill someone else, or just try to end your own existence. There's so much in Kult that can be different from traditional gaming.
Yeah, it's definitely like kind of pulling from the movie What Dreams May Come, where Robin Williams is he's dead and he has this afterlife image that he's always kind of gleaned from the images of his wife, and other people come and kind of share in that image. But it was definitely kind of that relationship between the writer, the GM, and the players, where you have this image in mind, you start creating this beautiful world and story with it, and then as you pass it on, almost like a game of telephone, you kind of see what different colors and instances of the picture is changed and explored.
And I think that's something that at least I try to do when I do the writing, is to I can't put down everything that people do.
Yeah.
that the players do. It's impossible. You have to rely on the game master to do stuff, but you still have to sort of take into consideration some of the most common reactions, and I think that's something that I've seen playing almost 40 years. It's some patterns emerge as to what the players do, and you have to sort of take that into account. What if they try to go to the authorities? You have to have a little short notice about what happens then. What happens if they want to do this? What happens if they want that? But still, don't try to second guess the players, because they will always do something different. They will always do something that you haven't thought about. And I think that I know friends who never play ready-made adventures because they can't be tailored to my group. And that's perfectly a valid way of playing, of course, because the only difference between me writing an adventure and them writing an adventure is that my adventures have sometimes been published for lots of people, and Game Master's adventures are maybe for their own gaming group, but that's the distribution is the only difference, because they have to sort of solve the same problems, basically.
It's interesting. So we're coming up at the end of the interview, and it has been such a great time. But so you have the Bitter Reach, which of course if everyone is curious about it, that will be down in the links for people to check out and to buy, and we definitely encourage, as well as Kult Divinity Lost, which has just finished its Kickstarter. So when Pledge Manager comes up, if you haven't already, make sure to get the book so that you can explore these adventures.
It closed a couple of hours ago, actually. So I think the Pledge Manager should be up soon.
So what is in the future for you? What can we look forward to that you are working on, if you can tell us?
I'm going to write a couple of short additions to the Bitter Reach campaign. And,
Cannibalism, right?
Sorry?
Cannibalism?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, why not? Why not? Some horror elements there. It's something I do, evidently. I'll do that, and I've just handed off my contribution to a British published fantasy role-playing game that will have a source book out in a while. I can't, by contract, say that is, but it's something that I wanted to do for a long while. And I got the chance to do it, and I'm very happy to do that. And of course, when I did this update for Petter, I didn't know what they wanted to do with the. And they asked me, I wasn't really sure what they wanted to do, and then they said, "Well, we can put it in this Kickstarter." And I wouldn't have put it past me to do some more cult stuff. I did write some more adventures that weren't that psychological that as His Last Hope will be, that were more shock value, and I'll ask Petter if he wants me to update that as well.
Excellent.
Just for fun.
Yeah, I think it'd be the more scenarios out there and the more kind of perspectives always makes the game better.
Exactly, and that's one thing. That's one thing about any game, of course. But I think that about Cult in particular is that there are so many ways of playing that. You don't have to play it as a psychological game. You can play it as a Hellraiser version of you can change it to fit your preferred style. And I think that people should acknowledge that not everyone wants to be heavily into the psychological aspects of the game, but also that lots of people don't want to be heavily into just having a pinhead coming out of the walls and you apart, even though that is cool, actually. It is.
All right, well, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. Of course, all the links are below, and we hope to speak with you again. And for everyone watching, see you later.
Yeah, thanks. Bye. Cheers. Bye.